Security cameras captured a young mother and her toddler checking out of a grocery store on a Monday afternoon. They looked normal. Calm. Alive. 48 hours later, they would both be dead, buried in shallow graves, soaked in gasoline. And the man who killed them would calmly lead police straight to their bodies. Welcome to Coldcase Crimelab. I'm your host, and what you're about to hear is a true story. A story of love turned to terror. A story of red flags ignored. A story of a monster hiding in plain sight. This is the case of Jasmine Lovett and her baby daughter Aaliyah, and this is how their lives were stolen. Before we dive into this heartbreaking investigation, if you're serious about true crime and want to see justice for victims who can't speak for themselves, hit that subscribe button right now. We're building a community of truth seekers, and every subscription helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light. Don't just watch, be part of the solution. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's get justice together. Now, let's begin at the beginning. Let's start with Jasmine. Jasmine Lovett was born in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and lived her entire 25 years in the city she loved. Standing 5 foot 4 inches tall with brown hair and brown eyes, she was described by everyone who knew her the same way. Quiet. Loving. Caring. But above all else, she was a mother. Her own mother, Kim Blanchard, would later tell the court through tears, she was the best mom. She really loved being a mom. Jasmine's sister, Genevieve, remembered how devoted she was to family. Regular phone calls. Weekly visits. The kind of daughter and sister everyone hopes to have. But Jasmine's life hadn't been easy. As a young single mother, she worked hard to provide for little Aaliyah. She worked at a daycare, surrounded by children, doing what she loved most, caring for kids. Her co-workers remember her as gentle, patient, always with a smile for the little ones in her care. She lived modestly in Calgary's northeast, in a small apartment she'd made into a home for her and her daughter. Photos from her social media show a young woman who, despite life's challenges, radiated happiness when she was with her child. Aaliyah was her world. Her everything. Her reason for getting up every morning. Aaliyah Sanderson was 22 months old. Not quite 2 years on this earth. She had her whole life ahead of her. Birthdays. First days of school. Graduations. A career. Maybe children of her own someday. But she would never experience any of that. Because in April of 2019, Aaliyah's life was cut short before it really began. Before we get to how that happened, we need to talk about the man who made it happen. His name is Robert Keith Leeming. But friends and people who knew him called him Keith. Born in 1981, Keith was 34 years old in the spring of 2019. He stood 6 feet tall, a large man with brown hair and blue eyes. On paper, he seemed relatively normal. He worked as a tradesman, doing concrete and construction work. He lived in the Greenwood Village area of Calgary. He drove a white Dodge Ram pickup truck. To casual observers, he was just another working-class guy trying to make a living. But beneath that ordinary exterior lurked something dark. Something violent. Something that had been building for years. Keith Leeming had a history. Not a criminal history in the traditional sense, not at first anyway, but a history nonetheless. A history of anger. A history of control. A history that, if anyone had looked closely enough, would have revealed the monster he truly was. But in 2019, when Jasmine Lovett swiped right on his profile on the dating app Plenty of Fish, she didn't know any of that. She didn't know what she was letting into her life. She didn't know she was inviting a killer into her home. Let's talk about how they met. In the modern age, dating apps have become the norm. Plenty of Fish, Tinder, Bumble, Match, there are dozens of them. People create profiles, upload photos, write little bios about themselves, and then swipe through potential matches. It's convenient. It's easy. And for single parents like Jasmine, it offered a chance at companionship without having to navigate the bar scene or leave her daughter with a sitter. From the comfort of her couch, after Aaliyah was asleep, Jasmine could browse profiles and chat with potential partners. Keith Leeming's profile on Plenty of Fish looked normal enough. He posted pictures of himself. He described his work. He probably mentioned his interests. And when Jasmine's profile appeared on his screen, he swiped right. She swiped right too. They matched. They started talking. Text messages at first. Getting to know each other. The usual dance of early dating. What do you do for work? What are your hobbies? Do you have kids? Keith knew Jasmine had a daughter. She was upfront about being a mother. It was the most important part of her identity. And Keith, to his credit initially, seemed okay with that. He seemed interested in getting to know both of them. The relationship moved relatively quickly. This is common in the world of online dating. When you meet someone in person, at work or through friends, the relationship typically develops slowly. Coffee dates. Dinner. Movies. Getting to know each other over weeks or months. But with dating apps, there's often an accelerated intimacy. You've already shared so much through messaging. You've already seen each other's photos. You feel like you know each other before you even meet. So when Keith and Jasmine finally met in person, it probably felt natural to move things along. Within a few months, Keith was spending a lot of time at Jasmine's apartment. He was meeting Aaliyah. Playing the role of potential father figure. And here's where we need to pause and talk about something important. Something that would become crucial to this case. Keith Leeming had a dog. A large dog. An Akita, to be specific. Akitas are beautiful dogs, powerful and loyal, originally bred in Japan for guarding and hunting. They're large animals, typically weighing between 70 and 130 pounds. They're intelligent. They're protective. And in the right hands, with proper training and care, they can be wonderful companions. But Keith Leeming's dog was not in the right hands. Multiple people who knew Keith, who had visited his home or encountered him with his dog, would later tell police the same thing. Keith was abusive to his animal. He was cruel. He was violent. They witnessed him hitting the dog. Kicking the dog. Yelling at the dog. Treating this living creature with shocking brutality. And here's what we know from decades of research into criminal behavior: animal cruelty is a massive red flag. It's not just meanness. It's not just a bad temper. Animal cruelty is a predictor of violence toward humans. The FBI includes animal abuse in its analysis of violent offenders. Sociologists and psychologists have established clear links between animal cruelty and domestic violence. Between animal cruelty and child abuse. Between animal cruelty and murder. Keith Leeming was violent toward his dog. Multiple people saw it. And nobody reported it. Nobody called animal control. Nobody called the police. This is one of the great tragedies of this case. If someone had reported Keith's abuse of his dog, if authorities had investigated, if he'd been charged with animal cruelty, Jasmine and Aaliyah might still be alive today. But hindsight is 20/20. And in the spring of 2019, Keith's abuse of his animal went unreported, and he remained free to continue his relationship with Jasmine Lovett. As winter turned to spring in Calgary, Keith was spending more and more time with Jasmine and Aaliyah. He was essentially living at her apartment, though he maintained his own residence in Greenwood Village. To the outside world, they looked like a couple. A family, even. Keith, Jasmine, and little Aaliyah. But inside that apartment, behind closed doors, something was wrong. We don't know all the details. Jasmine didn't confide in many people about problems in the relationship. She was a private person, quiet, the type to handle things on her own. But we do know that by mid-April, something had changed. April 15, 2019. Monday afternoon. That's when the security footage captured Jasmine and Aaliyah at the grocery store, walking through the checkout line at 3:06 p.m. It would be the last time anyone outside of Keith Leeming would see them alive. They went home after that shopping trip. Jasmine probably put away the groceries. Maybe she made dinner. Maybe she gave Aaliyah a bath and put her to bed. We don't know exactly what happened that evening. But we do know that Keith was there. And we know that at some point in the next 48 hours, he killed them both. The exact sequence of events, the precise timeline of how Jasmine and Aaliyah died, would take investigators months to piece together. But here's what we do know. Keith Leeming murdered Jasmine Lovett and her 22-month-old daughter Aaliyah in Jasmine's apartment. He killed a young mother and a toddler. A woman who trusted him. A child who had no defenses. And then, in an act of shocking callousness, he disposed of their bodies. Keith didn't just kill Jasmine and Aaliyah. He planned what to do with their bodies. He loaded them into his white Dodge Ram pickup truck. He drove them out of the city. He drove west, into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. He drove to a remote area near Grizzly Creek, in Kananaskis Country, a sprawling wilderness area west of Calgary. This is rugged terrain. Forest. Mountains. Wildlife. Miles and miles of isolated wilderness where a person could disappear. Where two bodies could be hidden. Keith found a spot far from the road. Far from any trails. Deep in the woods where hikers rarely ventured. And there, in that isolated place, he dug graves. Shallow graves. He buried Jasmine and Aaliyah. And then, in a detail that still shocks investigators and prosecutors to this day, he poured gasoline over their bodies. Gallons of gasoline, soaking the earth, soaking the remains, an apparent attempt to accelerate decomposition or perhaps to destroy DNA evidence. Then he covered them with dirt and left them there. He left a mother and her baby daughter in shallow graves in the Canadian wilderness and drove back to Calgary. Back in the city, people started to notice that Jasmine and Aaliyah were missing. It wasn't immediate. Jasmine was a quiet person, not someone who checked in with people every single day. But by the end of the week, alarm bells were starting to ring. Jasmine's mother, Kim, tried calling her daughter. No answer. She tried texting. No response. She tried reaching out on social media. Nothing. This wasn't like Jasmine. Even though she was busy with work and caring for Aaliyah, she always stayed in touch with her family. She always returned calls. She always responded to texts. Kim Blanchard started calling around. She called Jasmine's work. Jasmine hadn't shown up for her shifts at the daycare. That was extremely unusual. Jasmine was responsible. She was dedicated. She wouldn't just not show up to work. Kim called Jasmine's friends. No one had heard from her. Kim called Jasmine's sister, Genevieve. She hadn't heard from Jasmine either, and that was very unlike her sister. By April 19th, just 4 days after that grocery store video, Kim Blanchard knew something was terribly wrong. She called the Calgary Police Service and reported her daughter and granddaughter missing. The Calgary Police Service opened a missing persons investigation. Officers went to Jasmine's apartment. There was no answer when they knocked. The apartment seemed quiet. There were no obvious signs of disturbance visible from outside. But Jasmine and Aaliyah were nowhere to be found. Police started interviewing people in Jasmine's life. Co-workers. Friends. Family members. And very quickly, one name kept coming up. Keith Leeming. Jasmine's boyfriend. The man she'd been seeing for the past few months. The man who had been spending a lot of time at her apartment. Police located Keith and brought him in for questioning. This is standard procedure in missing persons cases, especially when the missing person is a young woman. Police always look at the intimate partner first, because statistically, that's where the danger usually comes from. In cases of murdered women, the perpetrator is most often a current or former intimate partner. So detectives sat down with Keith Leeming and asked him about Jasmine and Aaliyah. Keith's story was that he didn't know where they were. He said he'd last seen them a few days ago. He said everything had been fine. He said he had no idea where Jasmine might have gone or why she wasn't answering her phone. He seemed concerned, at least on the surface. He said he hoped they were okay. He said he wanted to help find them. The detectives pressed him. They asked detailed questions about his relationship with Jasmine. They asked about their last interactions. They asked if they'd been fighting. Keith maintained his story. He didn't know where they were. He had nothing to do with their disappearance. But police weren't buying it. There were inconsistencies in Keith's story. Details that didn't add up. And detectives had that instinct, that gut feeling that comes from years of experience, that Keith Leeming knew more than he was saying. But instinct isn't evidence. A gut feeling won't get you a conviction in court. Police needed proof. They needed to find Jasmine and Aaliyah. And they needed to build a case against Keith Leeming. Days turned into weeks. April became May. Jasmine and Aaliyah were still missing. Their faces were all over the news. Missing persons posters were distributed throughout Calgary. Social media was flooded with appeals for information. Anyone who might have seen Jasmine or Aaliyah, anyone who knew anything, was urged to contact police. Kim Blanchard made tearful public pleas for her daughter and granddaughter to come home, or for anyone with information to come forward. The entire city was watching. Waiting. Hoping for a miracle. Behind the scenes, police were working around the clock. They were analyzing Jasmine's phone records. They were pulling surveillance footage from around her apartment building. They were interviewing everyone who knew her. And they were watching Keith Leeming. Police surveillance teams were keeping tabs on his movements. Detectives were digging into his background. And what they were finding was disturbing. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. We're about to get into the investigation that would crack this case wide open, and you won't believe the tactics police used to get a confession. Keith Leeming had a history that police were now uncovering. While he didn't have a major criminal record, he had red flags in his past. Former girlfriends described him as controlling, jealous, quick to anger. And then there was the matter of his dog. As police interviewed more people who knew Keith, the stories about his treatment of his Akita kept coming up. Multiple witnesses described seeing him abuse the animal. Hitting it. Kicking it. Screaming at it. This wasn't just a man who was rough with his pet. This was systematic cruelty. This was a man who derived some sick satisfaction from dominating and hurting a creature dependent on him for care. Detectives knew they were dealing with a dangerous individual. They believed Keith had killed Jasmine and Aaliyah. But believing and proving are two very different things. They needed evidence. They needed bodies. And Keith wasn't talking. He'd lawyered up after his initial interview, refusing to speak to police again. The investigation was at a standstill. But then, the Calgary Police Service did something extraordinary. They launched what's known as a Mr. Big operation. For those unfamiliar with this investigative technique, let me explain. A Mr. Big operation is a complex, long-term undercover investigation used primarily in Canada. It's a technique where undercover police officers pose as members of a criminal organization. They befriend the suspect. They gain his trust. They slowly bring him into their organization, giving him small jobs, paying him money, making him feel like part of the crew. And then, after weeks or months of building this relationship, they introduce him to Mr. Big, the supposed boss of the criminal organization. And Mr. Big tells the suspect that before he can truly be part of the organization, before they can trust him with big jobs, he needs to come clean about anything in his past that could be a liability. He needs to confess to any crimes. Any bodies. Anything that could bring police attention to the organization. It sounds elaborate. It sounds like something out of a movie. But Mr. Big operations work. They've been used successfully in Canada for decades, solving dozens of cold cases and obtaining confessions in seemingly impossible investigations. They're controversial, certainly. Defense lawyers argue they're coercive, that they involve trickery and manipulation. But Canadian courts have generally upheld their legality, with certain restrictions to prevent false confessions. In the case of Keith Leeming, Calgary police decided a Mr. Big operation was their best shot at finding Jasmine and Aaliyah and at getting Keith to confess. So they set the operation in motion. Undercover officers were assigned to the case. These are specially trained detectives who can maintain a false identity for months at a time. They're actors. They're improvisers. They have to be convincing enough that a suspect never questions whether they're really criminals. The undercover officers made contact with Keith. They did this in a way that seemed natural, coincidental. Maybe they struck up a conversation at a bar. Maybe they happened to be working a construction job near where Keith was working. However they made contact, it seemed organic. Keith had no idea he was talking to police. He thought he'd just met some new friends. Guys who, like him, worked with their hands. Guys who understood the struggle of making a living. Guys who, it turned out, were involved in some less-than-legal activities on the side. Over the following weeks, the undercover officers built a relationship with Keith. They hung out with him. They bought him drinks. They offered him work, small jobs that paid cash under the table. Moving some boxes. Driving something from one place to another. Nothing too serious, but enough to make Keith feel like he was becoming part of their crew. And Keith, who had been under suspicion for his girlfriend's disappearance, who was probably feeling isolated and paranoid, welcomed the friendship. He welcomed the distraction. He welcomed the money. The undercover officers were careful. They moved slowly. They couldn't push too hard or too fast, or Keith might get suspicious. They had to make this feel real. So they spent time with him. They learned about him. They listened to him talk about his life, his problems, his past. And gradually, they started mentioning their boss, the man they worked for, the man who ran their operation. Mr. Big. They told Keith that Mr. Big was looking for reliable people. That there could be bigger opportunities if Keith proved himself trustworthy. Keith was interested. The money was good. The work wasn't too hard. And these guys seemed to accept him, no questions asked. As the operation progressed, the jobs got slightly bigger. The pay got better. Keith was being drawn in, step by step, to what he believed was a criminal organization. The undercover officers would later testify that Keith seemed comfortable with the scenario. He didn't seem to have moral qualms about working for criminals. He fit right in. After several weeks of building this relationship, the time came for Keith to meet Mr. Big. The undercover officers told him that the boss wanted to meet him, to size him up personally. This was presented as a big deal, an opportunity for Keith to really become part of the inner circle. Keith agreed to the meeting. A date was set. And Keith Leeming found himself sitting across from Mr. Big, who was actually a senior undercover officer with the Calgary Police Service. The meeting took place in a hotel room. This is standard for Mr. Big scenarios, a controlled environment where police can record everything. Keith was nervous, understandably. He was meeting the supposed head of a criminal organization. But Mr. Big was friendly, at least initially. He thanked Keith for his work. He said the other guys spoke highly of him. He said there could be more opportunities ahead. But then Mr. Big got serious. He told Keith that before they could move forward, before they could trust him with bigger jobs, he needed to know everything about Keith's past. He needed to know if there was anything that could bring heat down on the organization. Any warrants. Any criminal cases. Anything at all that police might be investigating. Because, Mr. Big explained, if police were looking at Keith for something, and Keith became more deeply involved with the organization, that could lead police to all of them. They needed to know what they were dealing with. This is the moment the entire operation had been building toward. Keith Leeming sat in that hotel room, being asked by a man he believed was a crime boss to confess to anything in his past that could be a problem. And after some hesitation, some back and forth, Keith started to talk. He admitted that police had questioned him about his girlfriend. He admitted that she and her daughter were missing. And then, in a series of statements that would later be played in court, Keith Leeming confessed to killing Jasmine Lovett and Aaliyah Sanderson. He told Mr. Big that he'd killed them in Jasmine's apartment. He said there had been an altercation. The exact details of his confession were complex, and he changed certain aspects of his story multiple times throughout the conversation. But the core admission was clear: he had killed them. And then he'd taken their bodies and buried them in the wilderness west of Calgary. Mr. Big pressed for details. Where exactly were the bodies? Could Keith show them? This is crucial in a Mr. Big operation. A confession alone can be challenged in court. But if the suspect leads police to evidence that only the killer would know about, the bodies, the murder weapon, personal belongings of the victims, that corroborates the confession. That makes it much harder to argue the confession was false or coerced. Keith agreed to show them where he'd buried Jasmine and Aaliyah. On May 10, 2019, nearly a month after Jasmine and Aaliyah had disappeared, Keith Leeming led the undercover officers to Grizzly Creek in Kananaskis country. He directed them to a remote, wooded area far from any roads or trails. And there, in that isolated spot, he pointed to two shallow graves. He told the undercover officers that Jasmine and Aaliyah were buried there. That he'd poured gasoline over their bodies to help them decompose. That he'd covered them with dirt and branches and left them. The undercover officers immediately signaled for backup. Uniformed Calgary police officers and RCMP officers swarmed the area. Keith Leeming was placed under arrest. He was read his rights. And as police secured the scene, forensic teams moved in to begin the heartbreaking work of exhuming the bodies of Jasmine Lovett and her baby daughter Aaliyah. The recovery of the bodies took days. The graves were in rough terrain, and investigators had to carefully excavate the site to preserve evidence. The smell of gasoline was still strong, even after weeks. As they dug deeper, they found the remains of Jasmine and Aaliyah, exactly where Keith had said they would be. Mother and daughter, buried together in the wilderness, their lives stolen by a man Jasmine had trusted. The autopsy and forensic examination of the bodies would reveal the true horror of what Keith had done. Jasmine Lovett had died from blunt force trauma to the head. She'd been beaten. Struck multiple times with enough force to cause fatal injuries. The medical examiner determined that she'd suffered immensely before she died. As for little Aaliyah, the autopsy revealed that the 22-month-old child had also died from head trauma. Keith Leeming had beaten a toddler to death. A child who couldn't fight back. Who couldn't defend herself. Who probably cried for her mother as she was being killed. The forensic evidence also revealed something else. The gasoline that Keith had poured over the bodies had indeed accelerated decomposition, but it hadn't destroyed all the evidence. DNA was still recoverable. Forensic anthropologists were able to positively identify both Jasmine and Aaliyah through dental records and DNA comparison with family members. And trace evidence found on the bodies and at the burial site linked Keith Leeming to the scene. Fibers from his truck. Soil samples that matched. Even with all his attempts to cover up his crimes, Keith had left evidence behind. Keith Leeming was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. In Canadian law, first-degree murder is defined as murder that is planned and deliberate. The prosecution would argue that Keith had planned these killings, that he'd known what he was going to do, and that after killing Jasmine and Aaliyah, he'd carefully disposed of their bodies in a way designed to hide his crime. Keith was also charged with offering an indignity to human remains, for the way he'd treated Jasmine and Aaliyah's bodies after death. News of Keith's arrest and the discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through Calgary. The city had been holding its breath for weeks, hoping that Jasmine and Aaliyah would be found alive. The confirmation that they were dead, that they'd been murdered, that a toddler had been beaten to death, was devastating. Vigils were held throughout the city. Strangers left flowers and stuffed animals at makeshift memorials. And Jasmine's family, who had been living in a nightmare of uncertainty for nearly a month, now faced a different nightmare. The certainty of loss. The knowledge that Jasmine and Aaliyah were gone forever. Kim Blanchard, Jasmine's mother and Aaliyah's grandmother, spoke to the media after the bodies were found. Through tears, she talked about her daughter. About how much Jasmine had loved being a mom. About how Aaliyah had been the light of their lives. She talked about the unbearable pain of losing both her daughter and her granddaughter at once. She talked about how Aaliyah would never have her second birthday, never start school, never grow up. She said that no family should ever have to go through what they were going through. And she made a plea that Jasmine and Aaliyah's deaths not be in vain. That people recognize the warning signs of domestic violence. That people speak up when they see animal cruelty. That people intervene before it's too late. As Keith Leeming sat in jail awaiting trial, more details about his past emerged. Police investigated his history more thoroughly. They interviewed ex-girlfriends, former friends, family members. And a picture emerged of a man with a long-standing pattern of violence and control. Several of his ex-girlfriends reported that he'd been controlling and jealous during their relationships. One described an incident where Keith had become enraged over something minor and had punched a wall next to her head. Another said she'd broken up with him because she was afraid of his temper. And multiple people reported that they'd witnessed him abusing his dog. That dog, by the way, was seized by authorities after Keith's arrest. The Akita was evaluated by veterinarians and animal behavior experts. The dog showed signs of having been abused, including fear responses and scarring consistent with being struck repeatedly. The dog was eventually placed with a rescue organization that specialized in rehabilitating abused animals. It was one of the few positive outcomes in this tragic case. The criminal case against Keith Leeming moved forward. His defense lawyers, as expected, challenged the admissibility of the confession obtained during the Mr. Big operation. This is standard practice. Defense attorneys argue that Mr. Big confessions are coerced, that they're unreliable, that the suspect is pressured into saying what he thinks the criminals want to hear. In Keith's case, his lawyers argued that he'd only confessed because he was afraid of Mr. Big, because he thought the criminal organization would harm him if he didn't cooperate. But the prosecution had strong counter-arguments. First, Keith had led police directly to the bodies. This wasn't a case where he'd confessed to a crime but couldn't provide any details. He'd taken undercover officers to the exact location where Jasmine and Aaliyah were buried. Only the killer would know that location. Second, details of Keith's confession matched the forensic evidence. He'd described beating Jasmine. The autopsy showed she'd died from blunt force trauma to the head. He'd described pouring gasoline over the bodies. Investigators found evidence of gasoline at the burial site. His confession wasn't just a vague admission of guilt. It was detailed and corroborated by physical evidence. After extensive pre-trial hearings, the judge ruled that the confession was admissible. The Mr. Big operation had been conducted properly, according to Canadian legal standards. Keith had been informed that he didn't have to tell Mr. Big anything. He'd been given multiple opportunities to decline or to ask questions. The undercover officers hadn't threatened him or promised him anything specific in exchange for his confession. He'd confessed voluntarily, in the legal sense of the word, and the confession could be used against him at trial. The trial of Keith Leeming began in 2020. Due to the high-profile nature of the case and the graphic details of the crimes, the courtroom was packed with media, members of the public, and most painfully, Jasmine's family. Kim Blanchard sat in the courtroom every day of the trial. She wanted to be there for her daughter and granddaughter. She wanted to look Keith Leeming in the eye. She wanted to hear every bit of evidence so she would know exactly what had happened to her loved ones. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. They presented the evidence of Keith and Jasmine's relationship. They showed the jury the security footage of Jasmine and Aaliyah at the grocery store on April 15, their last public appearance. They brought in witnesses who testified about Keith's history of violence and his abuse of his dog. They presented the timeline of the disappearance and the investigation. And then they played the recordings from the Mr. Big operation. The jury heard Keith Leeming, in his own voice, confessing to killing Jasmine and Aaliyah. They heard him describe the murders. They heard him explain how he disposed of the bodies. And they heard him agree to show the undercover officers where the bodies were buried. The recordings were damning. This wasn't circumstantial evidence. This wasn't speculation. This was the defendant confessing, in detail, to the murders. The prosecution then presented the forensic evidence. Medical examiners testified about the autopsies. They explained the injuries that Jasmine and Aaliyah had suffered. They showed photographs, graphic and disturbing, of the remains and the burial site. They testified that both victims had died from blunt force trauma, consistent with being beaten. They testified about the gasoline found at the scene. They testified that Jasmine and Aaliyah had been dead for weeks before their bodies were found, and that decomposition had been accelerated by the gasoline. Forensic experts testified about trace evidence linking Keith to the burial site. Soil samples from Keith's truck matched soil from Grizzly Creek. Fibers found at the scene were consistent with materials from Keith's truck. And DNA evidence confirmed that the bodies were indeed Jasmine Lovett and Aaliyah Sanderson. The prosecution's case was comprehensive and overwhelming. The defense's strategy was limited by the strength of the prosecution's evidence. Keith's lawyers couldn't really argue that he hadn't killed Jasmine and Aaliyah. He'd confessed. He'd led police to the bodies. The forensic evidence confirmed his guilt. So instead, the defense tried to argue for a lesser charge. They suggested that the killings hadn't been planned, that they'd happened in the heat of the moment, that this was second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder. They argued that Keith had been under stress, that there had been an altercation with Jasmine, that things had gotten out of hand. But the prosecution countered that argument effectively. They pointed out that Keith had killed both Jasmine and Aaliyah. Even if one could argue that Jasmine's death happened impulsively during a fight, what possible justification could there be for killing a 22-month-old child? Aaliyah wasn't a threat. She couldn't have provoked him. Keith had made a deliberate choice to kill that little girl. And then, after the murders, he'd taken time to load the bodies into his truck, drive them into the wilderness, dig graves, pour gasoline over them, and bury them. Those actions showed planning. Those actions showed deliberation. This was first-degree murder. The jury heard testimony from Jasmine's family. Kim Blanchard took the stand and described her daughter. She talked about Jasmine's kindness, her devotion to Aaliyah, her dreams for the future. She described the moment she realized Jasmine and Aaliyah were missing, the growing dread as days passed without contact, the horror of learning they'd been found dead. She looked directly at Keith Leeming as she spoke, and she told the jury that he'd taken everything from their family. He'd stolen Jasmine's life. He'd stolen Aaliyah's future. He'd left a hole in their family that could never be filled. Jasmine's sister, Genevieve, also testified. She described their close relationship, how Jasmine had always been there for her, how excited Jasmine had been about motherhood. She talked about Aaliyah, about her personality that was just starting to emerge, about the little girl who would never get to grow up. The testimony from Jasmine's family was heartbreaking, and more than one juror was seen wiping away tears. The trial lasted several weeks. The jury heard from dozens of witnesses. They reviewed hundreds of pieces of evidence. They saw photographs that would haunt them forever. And then they were sent to deliberate. In Canadian criminal trials, the standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury had to be convinced, based on the evidence, that Keith Leeming was guilty of first-degree murder. Not just murder, but murder that was planned and deliberate. The jury deliberated for 2 days. This is actually a relatively short deliberation for a murder trial, suggesting that the evidence was clear and convincing. On the 3rd day, they returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreperson stood to announce the decision. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Jasmine Lovett. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Aaliyah Sanderson. Guilty of offering an indignity to human remains. The conviction brought tears and relief to Jasmine's family. Kim Blanchard sobbed as the verdict was read. It wouldn't bring Jasmine and Aaliyah back. Nothing could do that. But it was justice, at least in the legal sense. Keith Leeming would be held accountable for what he'd done. He would be punished for stealing 2 innocent lives. In Canada, a conviction for first-degree murder carries an automatic sentence of life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. This is the harshest sentence available in Canadian law, as Canada does not have the death penalty. For Keith Leeming, who was 34 years old at the time of his arrest, this meant he would be in his late 50s before he could even apply for parole. And given the nature of his crimes, murdering a young mother and her toddler daughter, it's unlikely he'll ever be granted parole. At the sentencing hearing, Kim Blanchard gave a victim impact statement. She stood in the courtroom and addressed Keith Leeming directly. She told him that he'd destroyed her family. She told him that not a day goes by that she doesn't think about Jasmine and Aaliyah, about the lives they should have had, about all the moments that were stolen from them. She told him that she hopes he spends every day of his life in prison thinking about what he did, about the pain he caused, about the innocent lives he took. And she told him that while he would one day have the possibility of freedom, Jasmine and Aaliyah never would. They would be gone forever because of him. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, noted the particularly heinous nature of the crimes. He spoke about Jasmine, a young mother trying to build a life for herself and her daughter. He spoke about Aaliyah, a toddler who had barely begun to experience life. He spoke about the brutality of their murders, the suffering they must have endured. And he spoke about Keith's actions after the murders, the calculated way he disposed of their bodies, the gasoline he'd poured over them, the shallow graves in the wilderness. The judge said that these crimes represented a betrayal of trust and an act of evil that shocked the conscience of the community. He imposed the mandatory sentence of life in prison with no parole eligibility for 25 years on each count of first-degree murder, to be served concurrently. Keith Leeming was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, beginning what will likely be the rest of his life in prison. But the story doesn't end there. Because this case, as tragic as it is, carries important lessons. Lessons about domestic violence. Lessons about red flags. Lessons about the importance of speaking up when we see warning signs. Keith Leeming didn't suddenly become violent the day he killed Jasmine and Aaliyah. He had a history. He showed signs. And the most glaring sign was his abuse of his dog. Let's talk about that for a moment, because it's crucial. Animal cruelty is not a minor issue. It's not just someone having a bad temper or being rough with a pet. Animal cruelty is a documented predictor of violence toward humans, particularly domestic violence and child abuse. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit considers a history of animal abuse to be a significant risk factor in assessing violent offenders. Numerous studies have shown links between animal cruelty and domestic violence. In fact, research indicates that in homes where animal abuse occurs, there's a significantly higher likelihood of child abuse and partner abuse as well. Keith Leeming abused his dog. Multiple people witnessed this abuse. They saw him hit the dog. Kick the dog. Treat the animal with shocking cruelty. And nobody reported it. This is not to blame those witnesses. People often don't know what to do when they see animal abuse. They might think it's not their business. They might not know who to call. They might worry about retaliation. But the fact remains that if someone had reported Keith's abuse of his dog to animal control or to police, authorities could have investigated. Keith could have been charged with animal cruelty. He would have entered the criminal justice system. And Jasmine might have known about his violent tendencies before she got too deeply involved in the relationship. This case has led to calls for better public education about animal cruelty and its connection to other forms of violence. Animal welfare organizations in Calgary and throughout Canada have used this case as an example of why it's so important to report suspected animal abuse. They've worked to educate the public about how to recognize animal abuse, who to call when you see it, and why it matters. Because it does matter. Animal abuse isn't just about protecting animals, though that's certainly important. It's also about protecting humans. It's about identifying violent individuals before they escalate to hurting people. This case also highlights the realities of domestic violence and the dangers of intimate partner relationships. Statistically, the most dangerous person to a woman is often her intimate partner. The majority of women who are murdered are killed by a current or former boyfriend or husband. Domestic violence is a massive problem, in Canada and worldwide, and it often escalates gradually. It might start with controlling behavior. Jealousy. Monitoring where the partner goes, who they talk to. Then it might escalate to verbal abuse. Name-calling. Insults. Degradation. Then it might escalate to physical violence. And too often, it ends in murder. We don't know all the details of Keith and Jasmine's relationship. We don't know if Keith was abusive toward Jasmine before he killed her. She didn't report any abuse to police. She didn't confide in many people about problems in the relationship. But we do know that Keith had a history of being controlling and jealous with previous girlfriends. We know he had a violent temper. We know he was capable of extreme cruelty, as evidenced by his treatment of his dog. These were all red flags. And Jasmine, unfortunately, didn't know about them or didn't recognize them as the warning signs they were. This case has also sparked discussion about the use of dating apps and the risks of meeting romantic partners online. Jasmine met Keith through Plenty of Fish, a popular dating app. Dating apps have become incredibly common in modern society. Millions of people use them. And for the vast majority of users, dating apps are perfectly safe. They're a convenient way to meet potential partners. But there are risks. When you meet someone online, you don't have the usual social vetting that comes with meeting someone through friends or family. You don't have mutual acquaintances who can vouch for the person. You don't have a shared history or context. You only know what the person chooses to tell you. Keith Leeming's dating profile probably seemed normal. He probably presented himself as a regular guy, a working man looking for a relationship. Jasmine had no way of knowing about his history of violence, his abuse of his dog, his controlling behavior with ex-girlfriends. That information wasn't on his dating profile. And by the time red flags might have started appearing in their relationship, Jasmine was already emotionally invested. She'd already let him into her life and her daughter's life. There's no easy solution to this problem. Dating apps aren't going away, and the reality is that most people who use them have perfectly safe, normal experiences. But this case does underscore the importance of being cautious when meeting someone new, especially when children are involved. Take things slowly. Don't rush into letting a new partner move in or meet your kids. Pay attention to red flags, things like jealousy, controlling behavior, anger issues, or cruelty to animals or other people. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And don't ignore warning signs just because you want the relationship to work out. Jasmine's family has become advocates for domestic violence awareness since her death. Kim Blanchard and Genevieve have spoken at events, shared their story, and worked to educate people about the warning signs of dangerous relationships. They've partnered with domestic violence organizations to spread the message that abuse is not just physical violence. It includes emotional abuse, controlling behavior, isolation from friends and family, and yes, cruelty to animals. They've encouraged people to speak up if they see these warning signs in a friend or family member's relationship. They've emphasized that it's better to interfere and be wrong than to stay silent and have someone end up dead. The Calgary Police Service has also used this case as a training example, particularly the Mr. Big operation that solved it. The operation against Keith Leeming is considered a textbook example of how Mr. Big operations should be conducted. The undercover officers built a genuine relationship with Keith over weeks. They didn't rush the process. They gave Keith multiple opportunities to decline to participate. They didn't threaten him or promise him specific benefits. And crucially, they obtained information that only the killer would know, the location of the bodies, which corroborated his confession. Mr. Big operations are controversial, and there are ongoing debates in Canadian legal circles about their use. Critics argue that they're manipulative, that they take advantage of vulnerable suspects, that they can lead to false confessions. There have been cases where Mr. Big confessions were later proven to be false, where suspects confessed to crimes they didn't commit because they were under financial or psychological pressure from the undercover criminal organization. As a result, Canadian courts have imposed stricter standards on Mr. Big operations in recent years, requiring judges to carefully examine each case to ensure the confession was voluntary and reliable. But in Keith Leeming's case, there's no question that the confession was true. He led police directly to Jasmine and Aaliyah's bodies. He provided details that matched the forensic evidence. The Mr. Big operation didn't create a false confession. It simply gave Keith a reason to confess to crimes he'd actually committed. And because of that operation, because of the skill and dedication of the undercover officers who spent weeks building a case, Jasmine and Aaliyah received justice. Today, Keith Leeming sits in a federal penitentiary somewhere in Canada. He's serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He's 59 years old now, as of 2026. By the time he's eligible to apply for parole, he'll be in his late 50s approaching 60. And even then, parole is far from guaranteed. The Parole Board of Canada will consider the nature of his crimes, his behavior in prison, his level of remorse, and the risk he poses to public safety. Given that he murdered a young mother and her toddler daughter in a particularly brutal and calculated way, it's likely that the Parole Board will deny any application for parole. Keith Leeming will probably die in prison. As for Jasmine and Aaliyah, they're gone. They were laid to rest together in a cemetery in Calgary. Their graves are side by side, mother and daughter reunited in death as they were in life. The headstone bears their names, their dates of birth and death, and a simple inscription. Forever in our hearts. Always together. On their birthdays and on the anniversary of their deaths, Kim Blanchard visits the graves. She brings flowers. She talks to her daughter and granddaughter. She tells them about what's happening in the family, about the nieces and nephews who will never know Aaliyah, about how much they're missed. The apartment where Jasmine and Aaliyah lived has new tenants now. Life goes on, even in places touched by tragedy. The grocery store where Jasmine pushed her cart with Aaliyah in the basket is still there, still busy with shoppers going about their daily lives. And Grizzly Creek, where Jasmine and Aaliyah were buried, is still a quiet spot in the wilderness, visited occasionally by hikers who have no idea of the horror that unfolded there. But for those who knew and loved Jasmine and Aaliyah, life will never be the same. Kim Blanchard lost her daughter and her granddaughter in one horrific act of violence. Genevieve lost her sister and her niece. Aaliyah's father lost his daughter. Jasmine's friends lost someone they cared about. And the children at the daycare where Jasmine worked lost a caregiver who was kind and patient and loving. This case serves as a stark reminder of the realities of domestic violence, of how quickly a relationship can turn deadly, of how warning signs are often missed or ignored. It reminds us that animal cruelty is not a trivial matter but a serious red flag for violence. It reminds us of the importance of trusting our instincts when something doesn't feel right in a relationship. And it reminds us that behind every crime statistic, there are real people. Real families. Real lives destroyed. Jasmine Lovett was 25 years old when she died. She had her whole life ahead of her. She had dreams and plans. She wanted to watch her daughter grow up. She wanted to see Aaliyah's first day of school, her graduation, her wedding someday. She wanted to be there for all the milestones, big and small. All of that was stolen from her by Keith Leeming. Aaliyah Sanderson was 22 months old when she died. She was just learning to talk. She was starting to express her personality. She loved her mom more than anything in the world. She trusted the adults in her life to keep her safe. And one of those adults, a man her mother had brought into their home, betrayed that trust in the most horrific way possible. This is the tragedy of Jasmine and Aaliyah. This is why their case matters. Not just because of the sensational aspects, the Mr. Big operation, the shallow graves, the gasoline. But because they were real people with real lives that mattered. Because Jasmine was a daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend. Because Aaliyah was a little girl who deserved to grow up. Because their deaths were preventable. Because if someone had reported Keith's abuse of his dog, if someone had recognized the warning signs, if Jasmine had known about Keith's violent history, maybe, just maybe, this tragedy could have been avoided. We can't bring Jasmine and Aaliyah back. No amount of justice, no prison sentence, no memorial can undo what was done to them. But we can learn from their deaths. We can commit to speaking up when we see animal cruelty. We can educate ourselves and others about the warning signs of domestic violence. We can support organizations that work to protect victims of abuse. We can be there for friends and family members who might be in dangerous relationships. We can trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right. And we can remember Jasmine and Aaliyah, not just as victims, but as people who were loved, who mattered, who deserved so much more than the short lives they were given. Thank you for listening to this episode of Coldcase Crimelab. If this story has affected you, please remember that help is available. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous relationship, please reach out to a domestic violence hotline in your area. In Canada, you can call the Canadian Domestic Violence Hotline. In the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7. These services are confidential and free. Don't wait until it's too late. And now, before we end, I want to ask you to do something. If you've made it this far, if you've stayed with Jasmine and Aaliyah's story, if you believe that these cases matter, that these victims deserve to be remembered, then please do 3 things for me. First, subscribe to Coldcase Crimelab. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these stories to light. Second, leave a comment. Tell us what you thought of this episode. Share your thoughts. Tell us what case you'd like us to cover next. And third, share this video. Share it with someone who cares about true crime. Share it with someone who needs to hear about the warning signs of domestic violence. Share it with someone who might not realize that animal cruelty is a predictor of violence toward humans. The more people who hear these stories, the more people who learn these lessons, the better chance we have of preventing the next tragedy. So subscribe, comment, and share. Do it for Jasmine. Do it for Aaliyah. Do it for all the victims whose stories still need to be told. Thank you for watching Coldcase Crimelab. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never stop seeking justice.